and today I am going to take up paper 2 module 16 Women and Partition, Pinjar, the Ice Candyman, Jhootha, Sach and Lajja. Women and partition literature. Literature on partition gives voice to women much before historiography started recording these experiences. Voices from the writings of Rajinder Singh Bedi, Rahima Soom Raza, Ismat Chugtai, Manto Yashpal, Bhisham Sahni, Amrita Pritam were documenting in their stories and novels the experience of a trauma of unprecedented scales. These narratives were later substantiated by records of eminent scholars like Urvashi Butalia, Ashish Nandi, Veena Das, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin and Gyanen Pandey, and activists like Anis Rizvi. The meaning of home. Most of the women who had to leave their homes went away believing that they were going to return once the situation was back to normal. Many of them left their jewellery and other valuables behind, hidden in safe places. They could never imagine that a world apart from the sheltered existence that they were used to, living like generations of women before them. To confront hostilities of the partition was so harrowing and traumatic that at times they were numbed into silence, while many lost sanity. Sabah Gul Khatak, writing about the experience of Afghan women migrants, says, when Afghan refugee women talk of going home, they talk about going back to their watan. Home is thus intricately woven into the idea of belonging, belonging to a place, belonging to a community. Home represents a way of life, a way of being, a culture and a way of thinking. Similarly, in partition, as it was, the experiences of these women during the process of partition were totally different from their earlier life and its security. And even more difficult was the challenge of picking up the broken pieces and trying to build their lives once again, while being continuously haunted by the horrendous memories that were embedded in their minds. Let us take a look at the issues and the perspectives of analysis. There are two issues that need to be looked into while studying women and literature on partition. The first is a more general question of identity of the women, and the second, a more complex question, is related to the choice before her in the selection of the identity. Both sides considered women to be symbols of their honor, of their races, and their dishonor was a dishonor of their religion and culture. A woman impregnated by a man from the other race was an impure one, and the child born into such circumstances defiled the purity of the race. As a corollary ran the second condition. In most cases, the choices were not made by the women. They were accepted, the choices made for them by either the families or by circumstances. Urvashi Butalia, in her book The Other Side of Silence, talks about people keeping silent about missing women of their families. Talking about one such family, most of whose members had been killed during partition, she says, and I quote, "They had made no direct mention of their sisters, two of them, who had disappeared at the time. Everyone around them knew this story. I realized then that in this silence lay many histories of partition, the histories that have always hovered at the edges of those that have been told, histories that describe the dark side of freedom." Unquote. Let us compare the eastern and the western partitions of India. As compared to the western India, where partition came as a sudden rupture of the land, in the eastern part of the country, partition led to migration that continues even today. The first partition of Bengal was in 1905. It had also been along communal lines, but the 1947 division had a deeper impact. Manas Ray, in his memoir of the 1947 division, talks about his days in the settlement camps after partition and recounts the difficult condition under which they lived. The Cooper's camp where he stayed, the camp at Ranaghat, Bhadrakali and other places were refuge for thousands. For a patriarchal setup where they hardly ever interacted with men outside the family, women in hundreds were left to fend for themselves in alien lands. Violence that accompanied partition and migration was the same here as well. Ansua Basuroy Chaudhary talks about the gender dimensions of the trauma through narratives of the experience of 3 women. One of these was able to recreate a normal life for herself. The second spent hers in the camp in a state of dole, while the third woman moved out with her family and set her home but became senile when her family was lost in subsequent events. The Eastern Border and Literature. Taslima Nasreen's novel Lajja is about the events in Bangladesh around the communal violence following the Babri Masjid demolition, while The Golden Age by Tahmina Anam is about the events around 1971 War of Independence. Though there is no direct reference to 1947 partition, the shadows of communal violence in the phase are reflected in both the novels. Lajja is a more vivid treatment of the gruesome violence and the brutalities women faced, and raises issues similar to those in partition literature of 1947. It is the story of a Hindu family facing acute danger due to rising fundamentalist and orthodox forces in society around that time. But the violence that the writer is talking about and victimization that the women face is no different from the trauma that women faced in 1947. The difference in tone of partition narrative from the Bengal to Punjab could have been for several reasons. Whereas partition on the Punjab side spanned a single continuous slot of time up to roughly 1950, the Bengal side saw a continuous process in the form of migration. Another factor that was the scale of immediate migration was less in the east than in the western region. The narratives that emerge could be conceived on a bigger scale in the former, while the latter found the short story a much more suitable medium. Let us take a look by the works of women writers. The most important work that comes out as fiction on partition by women include Pinjar by Ismat Chugtai, Sunlight on a Broken Column by Atiya Hussain, Ice Candyman by Bapsi Sidhwa, River of Fire and Aadhi Raat Ke Humsafar by Kurthulain Haider, Zindagi Nama by Krishna Sobti, Clear Light of the Day by Anita Desai, What the Body Remembers by Shauna Singh Baldwin, and Can You Hear the Night Bird Call by Anita Rao Badami. Let us look at the narratives of the partition in various novels. First, we take up Pinjar. It is a landmark novel and one of the most effective narratives to take up the issue of the experiences of women during partition. Novel by Amrita Pritam, it is the story of Puro and Lajja. It epitomizes the story of thousands of women who had been abducted during partition. Puro had been abducted by Rashid just before her marriage. He later converts her and marries her. She finds it very hard to forgive Rashid for the wrong he has done. Although he loves Puro and proves to be a good husband, her family refuses to accept her back into its fold as she is now considered impure. When they migrate to Pakistan afterwards, when partition happens, Puro is told that her brother's wife Lajja has been abducted and kept by people from around her village. Rashid takes great pains to find Lajja's whereabouts and then, along with Puro, he succeeds in finding and rescuing her. Puro meets her brother and her one-time fiancé when she goes with Lajja to hand her back to the family. They ask her to come back and go with them to India, but Puro decides that she will stay back with Rashid and her son from his marriage with Rashid. Puro's identity. The choice that Puro makes is not the discovery of a new identity. She is torn between her lost identity from the past and her present identity. All the bridges that could have helped her revive her lost identity were burnt. She is a convert, a married woman, and most importantly, she has a child from the marriage. In the act of rescuing Lajja from her abductors, she is almost subconsciously saving herself. She says that with every woman who goes back home on either side of the border, Puro is reaching home. If Lajja had not been rescued, she would probably have met the same fate as Puro. She too would have been forcibly converted and married to her abductor, calling all the doors of hopes on her close as well. Puro knows that she can only yearn for her family. She qualifies what Sabakbul says about women who are connected to displacement. Equally importantly, there is a sense of happiness connected with one's relatives, as they are also a source of love and shared experiences of sadness and laughter. These are important relationships that provide a sense of identity and a grounding due to shared values and shared lifestyles as well as experiences, unquote. Similar is the Ice Candyman, the story of which is a moving experience of women during partition. It brings out in its story, as a novel written by Bapsi Sidhwa, the life of the central character of Aya. The story revolves around Aya, but undoubtedly there are many other women and their experiences which are also a part of the narrative. The family lives in Lahore, and Bapsi Sidhwa captures the spirit of the city before and after partition in the story told through the eyes of Lenny, a little girl, a Parsi girl, who has an Aya to look after her as she is growing up in the last few years of independence. The gatherings at Lenny's house show the transition from communal harmony to mistrust among families who all belong to different communities. There is a breakup and scattering of neighborhood as some lose their lives, as in the case of the police officer, while others migrate sooner or later to places considered safer. The irony of the situation is that even after being witness to such massive violence and bloodshed, those who migrate still hold some hope coming back to their home someday to start life again. When we look at women as targets of communal violence, we find that the riots that ruptured the formation of the two nations were initiated by fanatics, but they soon became a cover for the fight for survival. The looting and grabbing of properties were the main motives behind most attacks. And when the sense of hurt and injustice that one felt subjected to were to be vented, women were the easiest targets. Partition was not just about ideological and intellectual disputes. The real tragedy and the real drama of partition took place on the streets that were witness to acts of unimaginable brutality and horror, and in the homes and families that were violated and destroyed. As Lenny's voice begins the narration, we are taken into a past where a man on the street is still unconcerned with the deep scars that the phrases called the two-nation theory would soon inflict upon him. The atmosphere at the park where Aya and her admirer friends gather becomes a barometer for the slowly rising heat of communal unrest. The admirers of Aya include both Hindus and Muslims, and it does not seem to matter to them that she is a Hindu. She is herself closer to Sharbat Khan initially. Even after a tension starts, she hands over her savings to him for investment. Their perception of life has place for ideological stands, and the complexities of partition are barely comprehended. When Lenny asks Aya about partition, Aya tells her they'll dig a canal, this side for Hindustan and this side for Pakistan. If they want two countries, that's what they'll have to do. Crack India with a long, long canal. Gradually, as the gathering around Aya starts acquiring religious overtones, they have debates and bantering which make Lenny aware of religious identities. She says, I became aware of religious differences. It is sudden. One day, everybody is themselves, and the next day they are Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians. People shrink, dwindling into symbols. Aya is no longer just my all-encompassing Aya. She is also a token, a Hindu, unquote. The friends polarize around their religious identities, and Aya starts getting closer to the Messiah. The ice candy man cannot stop her openly, but he finds the communal turmoil a convenient cover for getting rid of his rival. And in the communal frenzy that follows, he abducts Aya. Those very men who had been her admirers and almost worshipped her now become her violators, as she is reduced to a status of a prostitute and is a prisoner of the ice candy man. Her journey to India, to her family, is not a return to security, for she is not sure of how she would be received by them. When we compare Lajja and the ice candy man regarding women as targets of communal identity, another picture emerges of the kind of violence that was targeted at women. It is of a train full of dead bodies, amongst whom were the relatives of the ice candy man. There were a sack full of breasts of women. There is another incident of Rana watching in a semi-conscious state as rioters rape his sister after killing all men in the family. There is an echo of the incident in Lajja, where the dismembered body of Maya with her womb missing is found and leads to her family's eventual migration. In the same novel, the rape of the prostitute by Surojan is a reflection of the same mindset, where communal anger or frustration is vented on the female body. The point that needs attention is that in the latter case, the writers were people from other places who had either migrated or were, as was the case with the Akalis, people targeting the other community with avowed purpose of infliction of maximum damage on them. It was a part of political maneuvering and gameplay. Once they were successful in their agenda, the ball of communal hatred started rolling. Those who migrated to Lahore became symbols and in some cases instigators of communal violence. Once the distrust became violent, there was no controlling it, and Lahore burnt for weeks. This hatred started getting manifested in a growing mistrust and hatred among groups of friends. Jokes which were once cracked in good fun now became games of one-upmanship, and there was always bitterness in the atmosphere. The murder of the Messiah was a result of twin forces of jealousy and hatred, and with the Aya, her friends and her admirers turned into her violators, betraying her trust. Those who could have been only too glad to have her as a wife and who staked claims for her attention and affection now found her to be no better than the object for fulfilling their lust. She had been a source of constant joy and affection, and their betrayal converted her into a living dead body. Let's take a look at the role of the activists and the process of relief and rehabilitation. There is the other aspect of the experience of women during partition. There were women who in normal circumstances have been only too happy to spend their lives as per routine, but the trauma of partition brought them out of their homes and forward as part of rehabilitation and the rescue effort. There were a number of memoirs of women who were involved in rescue and rehabilitation work at that time. Most of them talked about how they were initially brought into relief and rescue operations simply because the numbers who needed help were so daunting and there were too few available to work. So, anybody who was willing or in a position to help in any way was roped in to assist in any way that they could. There were some who did it to gain political mileage out of the crisis, but there were a number who put in a lot at risk to help not just their friends and neighbors, but mostly strangers whom they had never met before. Lenny's mother and aunt belonged to one such group of women. In Sidhwa's novel, Lenny's mother and aunt belong to the rescuers. They are committed and strong women. They work day in and day out in every possible way. They provide petrol to those who were migrating and stored cans of it in their houses at a great risk. They worked in relief camps trying to send the women who could be sent back to their families and finding ways to rehabilitate those who had no families left to go back to or whose families refused to accept them. They were instrumental in rescuing a lot of women who would otherwise have never been recovered. Hamida was rescued by them and was kept as an ayah by Lenny's mother after the disappearance of their earlier ayah. And then with great effort, they are able to trace the ayah as well. They managed to rescue her from the clutches of the ice Candyman, who had kept her hidden in the red light area of the city and had used to exploit her. It needed not only great courage to be able to approach her after her whereabouts were found, but more to rescue her from there, especially because she was a Hindu. She was sent to India as per her wishes. The work of women like the mother and aunt of Lenny is not recognized enough. Had they not worked selflessly and ceaselessly, the trauma that women faced during the crisis would have been manifold. They not only worked in relief camps, but also went into interior areas where they got tips about the whereabouts of abducted women being held. Jhootha Sach by Yashpal narrates one such operation where, tipped by someone, a group of women including Tara are recovered and sent to India. Urvashi Butalia narrates the experience of her aunt being involved in the central recovery operations. Damayanti Sehgal talks about the difficulties they faced in rescuing these women, many of whom were not accepted by their families and many more who did not want to return because they were married to their abductors and even had children in many cases. They knew they would never be accepted by their families. Rajinder Singh Bedi's Lajvanti is the story of such a woman who was recovered and handed back to her husband and how her life could never go back to being normal again. He earlier used to harass her, beat her and abuse her, but afterwards she was handed back. She was all but worshipped by him, but ultimately she is unable to find acceptance as a human being. In Pinjar, the central character of Puro might not have been, please take it up, or yeah. In Pinjar, the choice of staying back for Puro might not have been imposed by her husband, but still other options of going back, leaving her child behind, is a more practical and socially unacceptable. She knows that even the prospect of finding her acceptance is very slim, and more so if she takes her son along with her. The Abducted Persons Act and Puro's crisis in Pinjar. Behera, talking about the rights of women during partition, says, and I quote, "Under the Abducted Persons Act, the government has passed an ordinance that these women whose babies were born in Pakistan would have to leave them behind, and those children that were born in India will have to stay back in India," implicitly acknowledging that the child belonged with the father, Hindu or Muslim. In implementing the government policy, the authorities actively discouraged women from taking their children with them and pressured those who were pregnant to have abortions before they returned to their families. At that time, abortion was illegal in India, but the government had kept a separate fund for these abortions. Ironically, such women and children were often spurned by their extended families and communities because they were now considered impure. Puro does not have the right to decide whether to go back or not. The decision is made for her by the system and the society that will not take her over to Rashid. The problem with the movement for upliftment of the condition of women in society was not that the most of these worked along the lines of social conviction. Those who were working for the upliftment needed to be socially influential in the region they were working in. With the turmoil of partition, the social fabric on which such movement was based had collapsed. The priority of the social workers was to shift to relief and rehabilitation. But after independence, there was an unprecedented spurt in the area of women's education and economic independence. People who had till then not given a lot of importance to the education of women now pushed hard for women's education. There was the problem of perspectives to deal with. Because the brutalities against women had strengthened the concept of women as property and symbols of familial and racial purity, their sexual violation defiled the so-called familial and racial purity. There was a need felt to provide them with legal security in their social environment. So, after dust started settling on the border, priority of the resettlement of such families was to find the feet for women. This included not just relying on the son to fulfill the task, but also for the girl to be prepared to help in the process. Tara in Jhootha Sach is able to survive through the crisis and find independence in life mostly because of her education. Earlier, education of the girl was a luxury and it was the son who would earn a living. The daughter was to be married off while the daughter-in-law was to manage the house and the children. In their individual levels, people now realize the importance of education of girls, making them economically independent. Ritu Menon and Kamla Bhasin in their seminal work note, the unexpected spurt in education of girls immediately after partition is reflected not only in the figures, but in the women's section of the government initiated schemes, but in the records of voluntary organizations. Another way in which women became more visible was through the relief and rehabilitation work that we have seen earlier. Most of these women would otherwise have spent perfectly placid life, but as we see, they are now going into relief and rehabilitation as a stopgap arrangement for the people. Karuna Chanana talks of 3 generations of women, and in a study done in 1955, she talks of the attitudinal changes among refugees in Dehradun. 56% women agreed that they should be economically independent, 81% believed that they should receive higher education, and 53% were of this opinion that the facilities for this should be made available to them. Girls now had a greater chance not only to complete their education without having to rebel against the families, but also find encouragement from the family for becoming economically independent. It is quite ironic that partition had been one of the worst phases for women, but on the flip side, It brought out in them the natural resilience and the capacity to struggle. It pushed them beyond boundaries that had been set for them by the families and society. They stumbled, hurt badly, but rose up and walked on to explore the new world that had opened before them. Thank you.